Good evening. Welcome to the Warrant Committee. Mr. Secretary, would you please take attendance?
I shall, Mr. Chair. In reverse order, Stephen Rhines, present.
I don't think he's with us tonight.
Judith Steele.
I saw her on the, she's on the Zoom. She's on the Zoom.
Ronald Sia.
Present.
Amanda Seria.
She's present, I see her. She's muted.
I'm here.
There she is.
Jeremiah O'Connor. Julia Maxwell.
Present.
Thank you. Timothy Lyons.
Present.
Dream Langlis. Kristen Cosile.
She's not going to be here tonight.
Julia Joyce.
Present.
Thank you. Jay Funling.
He's on
Jay's
this
here.
call. Yeah.
Thank you, Jay. Allison Gagnon. Lori
I'm
Conley.
here.
Thank you. Allison, sorry.
No, sorry, I'm slow.
Lori Conley.
Yes.
Thank you. And I am present, Thomas Caldwell. And
Yeah, this is Jay. I heard my name.
thank you, Jay. Thomas Caldwell, Secretary, present. Mr. Chair, David
Present.
Humphrey is also present.
Thank you. I declare quorum, call the meeting to order. We had 3 agenda items. One was to have a brief with regards to the budget from Nick, the town administrator. The intent there was just to have sort of a basic update of where the budget's at right now. What are some of the things that we're looking at going into the annual town budget, as well as at the fall town meeting. We decided just to kick that down the road a little bit. It was just basically to be basic, informative, not a pressing need in light of the importance of the MBTA zoning. We chose just to go with that. So we have the town planner, Mr. Tim Zawinski. And if that's, if I mispronounced that name, I'd be happy to be corrected. And is that correct, Tim Zawinski?
Flawless. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Wonderful.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Judy.
thank you. I had my hand up, but I realize you're a little light on people looking at computers tonight, so I just jumped in. I was wondering if you could go over the rules for hybrid and the number of members that should be present in person to have what they would consider a hybrid quorum. In our case, it would be 8 people. And OML could be triggered if we do not have 8. I counted 6 at the table. I could be wrong.
That's annoying.
What's that?
That's annoying.
I believe that Nick Milano told us over the winter that we don't have to have 8 people in person. We just need to have 8 people total.
Okay, so the information we had at the beginning of last year was incorrect.
It may be. I wasn't.
Oh, okay.
I just came up over the winter.
Okay, thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
Okay.
And thank you, Judy. Thank you, Judy. It does bring up, I think the purpose of tonight, and this is why I had asked him to come and to talk to us about the MBTA zoning, is to lay out some of the very basic principles here to start to create for us, the Warrant Committee, our roadmap for what's going to be expected of us, of how we're going to assist the town at town meeting with regards to this issue. I don't foresee what I would call like a vigorous and hardcore debate on the issue. I think it might be a little early for that. We are certainly not voting on anything. There's nothing here before us. So Judy's concerns about, open meeting are important. Is the purpose of open meeting is to make sure that our deliberations and our votes are open to the public. We want to have a quorum, and we want the public to be, invited and aware of what we're doing. I think the purposes of tonight's meeting, we're going to naturally avoid some of those concerns because, again, I think there should be vigorous questioning in a spirit of citizenship and of common purpose with the town planner, Tim Zawinski, right? This is not an inquisition, right? And then we would be likely to have, raise our issues and have some concerns, but I don't think this is a debate issue. We're definitely not voting. So, and that was our purpose tonight. So what I had asked Tim to please do for us is to give us like 20 to 30 minutes of the basics as if we were complete lay people, completely new to the issue of the who's, the what's, the when's, the where's, the why's, the how's, what is expected of us. Because eventually what's going to happen is the Warrant Committee is going to be presented with an article that's going to go into the warrant at the town meeting for the town's vote. And we're going to make a recommendation to the town. So at such time as we're called upon to be able to render our recommendation to the town, we need to be among some of the most informed and educated people on the issue in the town. And I would like to start at this point with the assumption that we're among the least educated and least informed so that we can, build this from the ground up. All right. And so, Mr. Zawinski, I give you the floor. Would you please educate us with regards to what is this MBTA zoning that the town is looking at?
Certainly, and thank you very much for having me. Before we get started, though, I think I need to be promoted to panelist so that I can share my screen, because I don't have the capability to show my slides right now.
Okay, if you can bear with us.
I believe I've just done that.
The other side.
Thank you, Karen.
There we go. Thank you very much for that. And one more really, really quick thing before I start, because I was actually very intrigued by the idea of a hybrid quorum. So I looked it up, and the guidance on open meeting law, while we have the sort of current suspension of the traditional open meeting law in place, and this is off the Commonwealth's website, any or all members of a public body may continue participating in meetings remotely. The open meeting law's requirement that a quorum of the body and the chair be physically present at the meeting location remains suspended. So you all are in the clear, but maybe not forever if we go back to sort of the regular open meeting law. So before I get started, formally, and I've got a number of slides that I hope are super basic. We have been doing this for a while. I've given versions of this presentation to the planning board, to the select board in a number of public forums. The purpose of a lot of those is to sort of like bring people along in the development of this zoning, and obviously provide opportunities for feedback at different points. So you're not going to get the super basic presentation because we're just out of super basic territory right now. We're in the thick of it. But if at any moment something's unclear, feel free to stop me. I know it's kind of tough sometimes with a hybrid meeting to kind of pipe up. But I'm happy to stay as long as it takes to answer any questions, and just want to make sure that everyone understands that I am available as the town planner. I've talked to a number of Warrant Committee members already who have kind of expressed an interest in this zoning. Give me a call, shoot me an email. It's a priority to speak to members of the Warrant Committee. So I'm happy to answer any questions and provide you with the resources that you need. So I'm going to share my screen and throw up a few quick slides. And actually, I think you need to allow me to share the screen now because it said host disabled screen sharing. There we go. So I'm going to throw this up on full screen. Can everyone see that slide? It's a picture of Capon Street.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. So what is the MBTA Communities Law? Back at the beginning of January 2021, there was a huge economic development bill that passed through the legislature, a ton of stuff in it. But one of the elements of it was a amendment to Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act, and it's called Section 3A. So sometimes you'll hear interchangeably MBTA Communities Act, MBTA Communities Law, Section 3A, 3A. These are all the same thing. And it is a law that's meant to spur housing production in the Commonwealth via loosening zoning regulations in areas near transit. So the requirements of 3A are that an MBTA community, and MBTA community is a defined term in the statute. There's 175 of them. For shorthand, anyone that has MBTA service, whether it's bus, ferry, commuter rail, rapid transit, is considered to be an MBTA community. Shall have at least one zoning district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing, which is defined in statute as 3 or more units, is permitted as of right and meets a number of other criteria set forth in the statute. And some of those criteria include a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre. The district is not more than a half a mile from a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, or bus station, if applicable. The zoning can't have age restrictions, and the zoning has to be suitable for families with children. And then in the statute, it lays out, a penalty for noncompliance, which is basically that the town is ineligible for certain grant programs, including MassWorks, the Housing Choice Grant Program, and the Local Capital Projects Fund. So this is January of 21. This slide is a little bit of a paraphrase of the language of the statute, but it's not that much of a paraphrase. This is really the bare bones of it. By right, which means no special permit, no discretionary review by the planning board or the Board of Appeals. You effectively can go in and grab a building permit for a multifamily building, just like you would for a single family house or an addition or a deck or something like that. Minimum gross density, 15 units per acre. It's a little more complicated than it sounds, but it just means, this is the residential density that they're looking for across the entire zoning district. No age restrictions. We'll get to the half mile radius in a minute because that gets even more complicated. But no age restrictions means you can't have 55 plus senior only. Your zoning has to be open for any type of multifamily building. And then suitable for families with children. The way that the state has gone on to sort of clarify that is simply your zoning can't put a restriction on the number of bedrooms in any given multifamily development. So you can't say we're going to allow any multifamily development as long as it has only 1 bedrooms. You've got to allow the market to provide, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, et cetera.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I just talk into this? I just had a question. Do we know what it says the impact? I don't know what those actual programs are. I'm not familiar with them. So do we have a financial, is there a number where it says the MassWorks, Housing Choice, and local capital projects? Do we have a number of, if we decided to bail out of this, of how much it would hurt us?
I've got a slide on that. So it comes a little bit later, but we can definitely talk about that, and also sort of the implications for noncompliance. So we'll definitely be getting to that.
Thank you.
So the law is about drafting zoning. So it's conceivable that there are cities and towns in the Commonwealth that already have compliant zoning districts where multifamily zoning is allowed and it's 15 units per acre and it's within, a radius of transit. And you could sort of count that as your compliant district. Milton does not have any compliant districts. We do have some multifamily housing in Milton. None of it is allowed by right. All of it is allowed by special permit. A lot of it has age restrictions, and some of it isn't at the density level that is kind of required by the law. So we've done some things that are kind of greater than single family houses, but nothing where we could say, okay, these are compliant districts, we're all good. So we're going to have to create new zoning districts is really sort of just the upshot of this. This is a map that shows that half a mile radius from transit. This is a map that was developed via a tool from the Massachusetts Housing Partnership that basically just kind of every station in the system gets its radius drawn around it. And so you can kind of see starting from left to right, Mattapan Station to Capon Street to Valley Road to Central Ave to Milton Station, and eventually up in the upper right, you get Cedar Grove Station. So one of the implications, and this is something that we commented upon really early when the law first came out, was we said, well, look, the Mattapan trolley line kind of hugs the northern border of town, and a significant fraction of that half-mile radius is actually either in the middle of the river or in City of Boston, which we have no zoning control over. And so, we raised that as a concern of, we've got to put a certain amount of density in a zoning district, but we don't actually have as much physical area as, if you look at, Needham, which has a number of commuter rail stations that are kind of right in the middle of town. So that half-mile radius captures everything in it is inside of Needham. Newton's the same way. The Dean line and the commuter rail line are all squarely in the middle of town. So there's no issue with, we've only got a certain amount of land that we're able to zone. So that has implications for the guidelines that the state put together. The statute also enables the state's housing agency, which at the time was DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development. It's since been elevated to a cabinet level secretariat. So now it's the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. If I refer to HLC, that's what I'm referring to, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. They put together a sort of a number of guidelines for compliance, for cities and towns, which was enabled by the statute. So I just previewed this slide. HLC guidelines for compliance really are there to give cities and towns a kind of a roadmap for what does reasonable size mean? What does it mean if you're required to zone within a half a mile of transit, but like Milton, you don't have as much area within a half a mile of transit? What does no age restrictions mean? What do all these things mean? And so it's, if the statute itself is maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs, the guidelines are like 30 pages, and that's how it tends to go with these sorts of regulations. So options for compliance. The location of districts within a half a mile of transit is actually now determined by how much developable area exists in that half mile radius. And so just like we said, our developable area is reduced by the fact that the Mattapan trolley is on the Neponset River and the border with Boston. So we don't have the entire half a mile radius to work with. And so the guidelines set a calculation for if you've got X number of developable acres within a half a mile of transit, you have to put 100% of your district within a half a mile of transit. And then a sort of sliding scale downward where if it's a little bit less developable area, then you're at 90%, then 80%. On that sliding scale where Milton falls is we are required to put only 50% of our zoning district within the half a mile of transit. And that's owing to the fact that, again, a significant portion of that radius is outside of town. So as a kind of, a gesture of, we want you to be able to do this and we want you to not have to necessarily put a tremendous amount of density in a small area, we have the flexibility to locate half of our zoning district basically anywhere else in town. One thing now on this next bullet about sub-districts, and this is going to be something that's kind of important to keep in mind, we don't have to have one huge blobby district. We can create multiple sub-districts in different areas of varying sizes in different sort of locations with different dimensional requirements. There's only a few restrictions on that. So you don't have to create one big blobby district, but half of your district has to be big and blobby to continue the metaphor. So at least half of the district needs to be contiguous. And then each sub-district needs to be a minimum of 5 acres. So just as sort of by way of example, if we were going to do a 50-acre zoning district, 25 of those acres need to be contiguous in one kind of big portion. And then we could do up to 5 sub-districts, because if it's 50 acres, 25 is contiguous, the other 25 can be in chunks of 5 acres or more. So that has implications as we kind of move on. And, we're going to be talking about sub-districts primarily. The requirement to create, quote unquote, a zoning district is effectively, the sum total of all of the sub-districts. So when you look at the maps that we're looking at and you look at the proposals that we're kind of playing around with, it doesn't really look like one zoning district, but it's kind of referred to as one zoning district. But just kind of keep that in mind that we're dealing with these smaller sub-districts.
Jim, can I ask a quick question before you move on from that slide?
Go for it.
So the fact that 50% of the compliant zoning districts don't have to be within the half-mile radius, it can be literally anywhere else in town, or does it just extend the radius further? Or are there any?
It can be anywhere.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of dimensional requirements, and this is kind of what zoning is. If you've ever had to, if you've ever built a house or put an addition on or tried to locate a shed, it's all about height, setbacks, density, lot coverage. These are kind of the bread and butter dimensional requirements of zoning. Those are up to us to decide, what we're comfortable with. It all needs to add up to, meeting all of the minimum requirements, but nothing in the statute or the guidelines say, you've got to allow 10-story buildings or you've got to allow 0 lot line, buildings. We have a fair amount of flexibility in terms of what those dimensional requirements are. And in terms of the density, each individual subdistrict can have a different density so long as the gross density of all of those subdistricts combined adds up to 15 units per acre. And so the very simple example that we use is, if you have one subdistrict that comprises half of the total zoning district, that can have a density of 5 units per acre, which, sounds like a lot, but it actually is really not that much. There's huge swaths of town that are more dense than 5 units per acre. So you could set that density as long as the other half has 25 units per acre. And so one half is 5, the other half is 25. That adds up to a total overall gross density of 15 units per acre. That's very simplified, but it's kind of the basic gist is as long as everything adds up to meet those minimum requirements, you can have different, different dimensions, different densities kind of all over.
Can I ask a question too again? I'm sorry, I don't.
Yes, go for it.
But is there some way, how do they figure out which neighborhood takes the hit? Because if somebody gets to put 5 in one neighborhood or in one sub area, then who's taking that massive density in which neighborhood? And is that going to be an election, or is that something people talk to? Like, I don't understand how we're going to figure out, or is it just what land is available where?
I've got some slides on that. And I mean, the sort of the ultimate answer to the question is town meeting decides, right? And, you know, town meeting, this is going to be a zoning law just like any other zoning law. You know, it's bigger than anything we've done since 1938, but it's the same principle of we're changing the bylaws, so town meeting needs to vote. Now, what eventually gets to town meeting is part of the process that we're engaged in right now. And, you know, I do have some slides about kind of the thinking that we're kind of working through, but just to kind of let you know what the process has been, you know, there is and we'll get to this in a little bit, but, you know, there's a tool that the state has that the state is going to use to judge whether a district is compliant or not. And it's a pretty sophisticated software model that, you know, takes the geographies that you're talking about in terms of where you want your districts to go. You input your dimensional requirements, and it kind of spits out, you know, are you meeting the overall density requirement? Are you meeting the unit capacity requirement? You know, yes or no. And so we're able to test different scenarios where, you know, what if we did a district at 40 units per acre here, and then a district of, you know, 5 units per acre here? You know, what would that look like? Would that get us to compliance? So a big part of the process has been just testing those scenarios to figure out, you know, what does compliance actually look like for us? We have been working with the planning board. MBTA Communities is a standing item on the planning board every 2 weeks. We've had monthly public forums where, you know, we try to keep people updated on where we are in that sort of scenario testing process. We get feedback. We kind of hear what people's priorities are. A couple things that I'll tell you that are kind of guiding our work in working with, you know, we've gotten state grant money to work with technical assistance providers, you know, to do a lot of this planning. A couple of things that are guiding our thinking is, you know, people have talked about equity and fairness, for lack of a better term, where, you know, we have the flexibility to locate zoning districts out of the transit area. And so, you know, the very principle that you're talking about of, you know, who takes the hit, you know, we're trying to spread this stuff around so that you don't have to do a super dense area in one part of town and then another part of town kind of gets nothing. So that's a principle that we've heard in public meetings.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but is there an option to do this without, I mean, I don't see that many undeveloped lots, right, along the train route. I live on Adams Street, so I can't picture, other than Hutchinson Field, like that whole thing from the trolley. I mean, how? Well,
I mean, a lot of what we're talking about would have to be, you know, redevelopment of existing parcels. And when you look in a couple slides, when you look at some of the areas that we're talking about, you know, you'll see some of these areas are probably not realistic for redevelopment for a lot of reasons, and some of them are, and we'll see that in a moment. The other principle that we have been trying to follow as closely as we can, and you know, we know this from the master planning process, we know this from every zoning process we've ever done. People, you know, prize the physical character of the town, the historic nature of the town, and so, you know, when we look at rezoning areas, what we're trying to do is minimize to the greatest extent possible the possibility of teardowns and give as many parcels as we can the opportunity or the possibility to be redeveloped in a, you know, a gentler way than just sort of tearing down a building and putting up an apartment building. And you'll see in a little bit how that kind of manifests itself. But, you know, the other principle that we're following is when we try to identify areas that are potential targets for rezoning is, you know, you could draw a 5-acre line around any part of town and say, all right, we're going to rezone this. But that's kind of arbitrary. There's no planning principle behind that. It's kind of not fair. What we're trying to look at is, you know, large parcels, non-residential parcels, either commercial, we don't have a ton of industrial, but places where, you know, the possibility of demolishing or displacing existing residential fabric is less. And when we get to some of the districts that we're looking at, you'll see that a little bit more closely.
Tim, could I ask a process question?
Yeah, go for it.
Tim, so process question. Who actually is going to draft the article and what are we going to get? Meaning, like, I can see where we might get, a couple of pages of black letter zoning law with a series of overlays or a series of maps that might be exhibits or something along those lines. So that's my question. Like, at some point, this is going to come to the warrant committee as an article. Like, what are we going to get? Who drafts that, and what's it going to look like when it gets to us?
So you're right. You're going to get language. It's going to probably be a decent chunk of language. One thing that I can do, and I'll make a note of this right now. The state has drafted, with the assistance of the Mass Municipal Law Association and a number of other groups, they've drafted a model bylaw that they have made available to cities and towns to use. And we intend to kind of lean on that model. So I can send that model bylaw along. It obviously does not have any sort of Milton specific information in it yet, but it is the sort of basic framework for what we're going to be using to kind of, populate that with the specific sub-districts that we're looking at, the specific dimensional requirements. One thing that you'll start to see later on in the presentation is that using the compliance model that the state has provided, that is doing a significant amount of the heavy lifting of figuring out, where the districts are going to be, what the dimensional requirements within them are going to be. It's not necessarily as easy as just sort of plug and play, but, we're going to use that model bylaw, shape it to our own needs and our own circumstances. And that'll be what the warrant committee gets. That'll be what, town meeting members get. And that's what it'll be, at town meeting is, zoning language. And then, we will obviously have, those visuals that show, what the exact geography of these districts is going to be. So, to this slide, and this is where we start to get into some of the really, I think, important details of the compliance guidelines.
Tom would like to ask a question. Are you mic'd, Tom?
I am. I believe I am.
Okay.
Could you turn the microphone on?
Hear me now?
See green.
Is it red light or is it green light?
It's no light. I'll pass, Mr. Chair. Let Mr. Planner continue. I can ask the question later.
Okay.
It's okay, I'm sorry.
Tim, we're good. You can continue, please. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I couldn't hear that. I apologize.
Yep.
So one thing that the guidelines that HLC has created is they categorize communities according to the level of their MBTA service. So if you go strictly by the law, every kind of city and town is kind of the same. Milton is the same as Ashby, is the same as Whitman, is the same as Cambridge. And I think HLC, as they were looking at that, started to think, these are towns with different sets of circumstances. If you've got commuter rail service, it's a lot different than if you've got red line service. And, there are a lot of communities that are referred to as adjacent communities that actually don't even have an MBTA station, but they're close enough to a town with an MBTA station that they have a fraction of developable area in their town. And so what HLC has done is they've sort of created these levels of service. So, rapid transit is the highest level of service. Then you have commuter rail, and then you've got these what they call adjacent communities, which don't have service themselves, but are close enough to service that they're going to be required to do some type of rezoning. So, the Mattapan Trolley is considered to be an extension of the Red Line. Milton is a rapid transit community as a result. under the guidelines. And so we sort of have, the highest obligation among the 175 MBTA communities. There are 12 rapid transit communities. If you look at sort of the MBTA sort of red, blue, green, and orange line map, you can see what those towns are. And so under the guidelines, the obligations that we have is one, a deadline for compliance of December 31, 2023. This is why we're having a special town meeting in December to sort of meet that December 31st deadline. And then we have what's called, a unit capacity that we're required to zone for. And that is tied to the statute's requirement that a zoning district be of, quote unquote, a reasonable size. Yep. And so the way that HLC sort of defines reasonable size is physically at least 50 acres. And then in terms of what is inside those 50 acres, depending on your level of MBTA service, you've got to zone for a percentage of your existing year-round housing stock. So we've got a zone for 2,461 units. That's 25% of the existing year-round housing stock. So we're going to use a term called unit capacity. That's what that is. That 2,461 number becomes really important. And that's kind of the number that we're chasing as we do, testing of different scenarios.
Tim?
Was there a question? I heard some folks talking.
I have a question of the difference between the law and the guidelines, because guidelines typically aren't enforceable by law. They're a guideline.
So the law empowers the state housing agency to create guidelines for towns to understand how they can comply. The way that the process will work is, cities and towns will create new zoning districts according to the compliance guidelines. They will submit that zoning to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, and they will, look and see if that zoning adheres to the compliance guidelines, and they'll either say, yes, this is compliant, you're good to go, no penalties, or they'll say, this isn't compliant for these reasons, you've got to go back and fix these deficiencies. So, they are guidelines, but also there's no one else that's going to judge these zoning districts except for HLC, and there's no other criteria that they're going to judge it by except for the compliance guidelines. So it's really the only roadmap we have for how do we get to compliance is the guidelines that HLC has created.
Yeah, but wouldn't it just be 15 units an acre and want compliance? You just pick a couple of spots like that.
Yeah, but how do you know how big of a district to make?
You make it as small as you can.
It's reasonable, and I think that's what needs to be defined, and that's what the HLC's guidelines would breathe life into.
I get it, but I live.
The state has told us what they believe a reasonable size to be, and if we're below that, then we're not compliant. And that it's just sort of, if the town wants to dispute that, the only venue for that then is court.
So
there's really only one path, outside of some sort of a lawsuit.
We can bring it up in our discussion.
Just think we should wait until Rockport gets theirs done. That's all. Why rehash something that might not have to be?
Do we have? So question, Tim, with regards, I couldn't help but notice in the Facebook, there was a post to the town of Milton that the select board has sent a letter to the MBTA board of directors seeking information regarding classification as a Mattapan trolley as rapid transit. What does that mean? What would the effect of reclassification be?
So this is kind of a little bit of a bank shot on the part of the town. So the guidelines create these tranches of towns. There are 12 rapid transit towns, Cambridge, Somerville, Quincy, Braintree, Chelsea, Everett, Medford, Somerville, Newton, Brookline, Revere, Lynn. These are all cities and towns that have, an MBTA color stop in them. And so the guidelines say these are the towns that we believe have the best service and have the highest obligation to provide additional housing. Because again, there are towns, way out in Worcester County that are MBTA communities. And, it would be nice if, Hamilton or some other town, Fitchburg, if they produced a ton of housing, but ultimately, the Commonwealth needs housing to be closest to the inner core. And so that's why those communities have the highest obligation. So there is a sentiment among some in town that, based on the condition of the trolley cars, based on the condition of the stations, based on the fact that, we refer to sort of 1 or 2 or 3 seat rides to downtown. Imagine if you got on the Red Line at Quincy Center, you could get to Park Street, Downtown Crossing, South Station, Kendall Square. You sit down once and you're downtown. That's a 1-seat ride to downtown. The Mattapan trolley represents, at the very least, a 2-seat ride because you get on the trolley, you have to get off at Ashmont, get on a new train. And, there are some folks that say, we don't consider this to be rapid transit. The service isn't good enough. We shouldn't have as high an obligation as Cambridge, for instance, which has, real Red Line service, right to downtown. And so we were asked and by we, I mean the town administrator and myself, were asked by, both the planning board and the select board to inquire with HLC, what was your reasoning behind these classifications? And some of them are obvious. Again, Cambridge is obviously a rapid transit community. Somerville is obviously a rapid transit community. There are some edge cases, Milton being, I think, the most obvious edge case. What were the criteria that you used to determine these classifications? And the answer we got back from HLC was kind of basically, this is what the T thinks. They consider these towns to have rapid transit service, and, we're the housing agency. Who are we to second guess the transit agency? And so, based on that, the question now becomes, okay, what does the T do in terms of classifying things according to rapid transit, commuter rail, bus, et cetera? And so, we have had some conversations with sort of other, not necessarily, directly related, folks at the T, how do you classify these things? We've been pointed towards the service delivery policy, the fare policy. All of these things basically say, the Mattapan trolley is an extension of the Red Line. It's considered to be rapid transit. And so that letter to the board of directors of the MBTA is basically the select board asking, you need to explain this a little bit more to us about, why this service that we have is considered to be rapid transit, because it doesn't look like all of the other rapid transit services. And so that's basically what that letter was sort of, a request for more information and a kind of, an assertion that, look, you've been doing this Mattapan transformation project for many years. When is this actually going to happen? In the meantime, all of these other lines have gotten new cars, have gotten new stations. The Mattapan trolley's been neglected. I mean, the stairs at Milton Station are a great example. And so I think that the outcome that I think, some folks, and I don't want to speak for the select board or the planning board or anyone that's spoken at my public meetings, but I think the expectation would be that, the T would look at these arguments and say, okay, maybe this isn't rapid transit. And then we would go to HLC and say, look, the T said we're not rapid transit. We shouldn't have the same obligations as these other towns.
Do we have ridership numbers?
There's no blueprint for any of this. So it really is something that, I don't want to say shot in the dark, but I think it is something that there's really no precedent. And so we're asking, we're making the best arguments we can. And we're, I think a really sincere and earnest kind of exploration of how the T kind of operates and what they do in terms of classifying these things. But, there is no procedure for reclassification. So, I mean, it's something that we're kind of pursuing and, we'll see what happens. In the meantime, we've got to kind of continue on the road that we're on, towards compliance.
Tim, is it true that Boston's exempt?
So it's true that Boston is exempt in the sense that, Section 3A is an amendment to Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Enabling Act for 350 of the 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. City of Boston has its own Zoning Enabling Act. It's Chapter 653 of the Acts of 1956. Very similar to 40A, but if you amend 40A and don't amend Boston's Zoning Enabling Act, then that means that 3A doesn't apply to the city of Boston.
Okay, one other question. Do you have ridership for the trolley based on station?
We have that data. I don't have it at my fingertips, but that's something that I can also pass along. We've gotten that from
For the
from
most of the
folks at the
ridership,
T.
is it true that most of it begins at Ashmont and or Mattapan? And there's really nothing in between except for maybe Central?
Yes.
It's probably true that a significant portion of the ridership on the Mattapan line starts in Ashmont or Mattapan Square.
So typically the people from Milton don't use the trolley.
Yeah, but I think one thing that you've got to understand about transit ridership is that the land use determines the ridership. We have statistics. There's like 11 boardings at Capon Street. On a typical day. That the T observed, which is barely anything. But if you look at the land use around Capon Street compared to Ashmont or Symphony Station or something, it's comparatively barely anyone lives there. So I think the whole point of the MBTA Communities Law is we've got transit service. Conceivably, there is capacity on the Mattapan line, especially in Milton, where people tend not to be riding it. We need to adjust land use regulations to enable more people to live on transit, to take advantage of these fixed assets that we already have, as opposed to, expanding service, somewhere else. It's about kind of filling in those stations where there's not a ton of ridership. With people who would conceivably take the train rather than kind of driving their cars.
Are they guaranteeing if we do this zoning, they're going to give us new rolling stock that can handle more than 50 people a car? We only have 4 cars that operate right now.
So the Mattapan Transformation Project currently has a budget of it's between $100 and $120 million. That is enough to get them to a 15% design on new tracks and new stations. So that's, it's not the end of the project, but it is a much more concrete end mark than we've ever had for this project. So it really then depends on, future capital budgets at the state level, future allocations from the Transportation Improvement Plan. But the plan is, the whole reason they're doing this is to put in new tracks and make station adjustments so that rather than using the old PCC cars, which are, among the only PCC cars left in regular circulation, that the tracks and the stations would be able to handle the same type of they use on the Green Line. So that, as the Green Line cars get replaced by newer vehicles, those vehicles can then go to Mattapan. Or, they could conceivably procure, the Mattapan line's own kind of, new vehicles. But, currently you can't do that. They don't make the PCC cars anymore. So we're kind of stuck in a cycle of refurbishment and fixing and just trying to keep these things online. So, there's no guarantee, but that project is more real than it's ever been at this point. And so, that becomes, a matter for, continued lobbying on the town's part, via our elected delegation, via the select board, via anyone that, has the ability to speak up about it.
So in theory, we could pass all this and never have the capacity. Because
I think it's important to understand that,
trains and they haven't.
There's capacity today.
There isn't, Tim. There's 4 cars.
What was
and
that?
50 people. There's not capacity that they say. There's 4 cars that they run one at a time that haul 50 people.
Yeah, but they run 10 of those cars an hour. So, there's the potential to be picking up 500 people in an hour in one of those vehicles.
When they're not running buses.
So, I mean, it's empirical. They run 6-minute headways, in the peak hour. I understand that, you know, the cars are not in great shape and they're small and there's only one of them. And that, you know, we don't have a lead pipe assurance that, you know, the transformation project is actually going to get built.
That's all I wanted to hear.
The view of the legislature in kind of passing this law is that if you wait for transit service to build housing, you'll never build the housing. The housing needs to come first, and the transit service follows. So there is capacity on the Mattapan line.
Thank you.
And the thinking is that the more housing you put on the line, the more incentive there is to improve that service.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna move on to the next slide. So just to very quickly.
I have a question before you move on. Sorry, I had to hit the unmute. So are you saying that our town council has not pursued reclassification?
I mean, it would be the select board that would do anything on behalf of the town. And at this point, they have sent a letter to the MBTA kind of requesting
Information.
Yeah.
Okay, but so have they, so the other part is, have they talked to town council though, like, and been advised to be able to provide a legal letter from our town council to say, ask for reclassification before we move forward in, you know, this whole process? Like, because, you know, that's just what I was thinking. Have they done that yet?
Well, I mean, it's not a legal question. It's more of a kind of a policy question and quite frankly, a political question. You know, because there is no, as far as I know, there is no procedure for reclassification. There's no law or kind of regulation that you can invoke. It would be, you know, what is the T's internal policy towards categorization of their own service and kind of, you know, asking them or compelling them to rethink it. So, you know, the letter from the select board, you know, is going to be the thing. And whether they choose to kind of ramp up the pressure on that based on the response that they get from the T, you know, again, is a question for the select board.
Okay, well, I just have one other. Has there been a study of the number of passengers on the trolley so that we could, you know, and how much money that is being taken from the amount of people that are going on the trolley?
So we have ridership numbers. The T does periodic observations of ridership. The Mattapan trolley is a little bit trickier than other lines. You know, if you go to Ashmont and, you know, try to find out how many people are getting on the train, you know, downtown at Ashmont, you just, you know, crack open the fare gate and all of that information is there because people are tapping their trolley cards. Because the Mattapan line is a little bit more loose in terms of fare collection, what they've got to do is kind of actually go out and have like direct observations of sort of counting people getting on and off the train. And so it's not as real time as certain data, but we do have recent data from spring of 2023 of how many people are getting on and off those trains. I can share that with the Warrant Committee tomorrow when I get back to my desk.
Now, is that broken down by the location where they enter the trolley?
Yes.
Okay, because I've read, how are they doing it? Is it just by the trolley director? The person that's, because it's not, you don't use a trolley card.
Right. So what I'm saying is when the MBTA wants to calculate how many people are getting on and off, they'll send a person out and you know, to each of the stations and kind of observe how many people are getting on at each station, how many people are getting off. I don't know the exact methodology, but it involves direct observation at a certain time. And so they'll go out during the peak commuting time, you know, when you've got the greatest ridership, and they'll go out and physically count people as opposed to, you know, again, you know, people walk on and off the trolley without kind of tapping their cards all the time. And so, you know, that's not a reliable way to count. They've got to actually kind of physically be counting people.
Okay, so you'll be sending how many so we can see, and how much does Milton pay the MBTA for the service? Do you know that?
I'd have to double check on that. We talked about this the other night at the planning board. I think someone threw around the number like $2 million is our assessment.
Okay.
and that's a formula in statute, kind of based on population. So
Sure.
I will find out.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all your information and your work.
For sure. We're only on slide 8, gang, so there's plenty, there's plenty of information to come.
Sorry about that.
No worries. That's why I'm here.
Tim, can I just clarify though, from something you said earlier, usage is irrelevant in all of this.
Right. So, it's undeniable that the Mattapan trolley is not as well used in the town of Milton as it is in Mattapan or Dorchester or other lines, compared to other lines. But it's kind of, that observation kind of makes the state's argument for it, that, there is service that is running whether people get on it or not. And sort of the goal is to sort of use land use regulation to increase the number of people that are using transit, as opposed to being kind of in housing that's further afield from the inner core and kind of driving their cars.
But I do want to point out, like, usage would determine a classification, because somebody getting a train system that's going from Ashmont is different with the amount of usage, and they're able versus a trolley system that has 10 people, so that's, for me, it's more of the classification.
Well, so the conversations that I've had with people in sort of the policy department at the T have kind of told me, and this is kind of, in their service policy, it's in their fare policy, is what they think about when they think about rapid transit is, what is the infrastructure? Is it a bus that's on the road and is kind of subject to traffic and stoplights and all of that, or is it a sort of a fixed asset, train tracks, exclusive right of way, no one can go on the train tracks except for the train, and then what is the frequency of the service? So both the the Stoughton line on the commuter rail and the Mattapan trolley both operate on train tracks, but the Stoughton train comes every half hour in the peak commuting time, and the Mattapan trolley comes every 6 minutes. So those two factors are two of the biggest factors that they consider when they classify things as rapid transit. And so, that becomes, the question of, if the Mattapan trolley is not rapid transit, what is it? We would be asking the T to kind of create, a third thing, basically, to classify the Mattapan trolley. And so that's why getting that clarity, and kind of identifying, like, look, we understand what your definitions are, but you have to understand on the ground, the trains are not in good shape. The stations are not in good shape. If there's a snowstorm, they can't get through the snow, and we have to, get on a bus diverted. So, it's kind of, they have a definition and they have a set of criteria. And I think what the select board's letter is kind of starting to try to articulate is there are additional criteria that maybe you should be thinking about. So we were talking about unit capacity. So the zoning has to have the potential to create 2,461 units. And so what unit capacity is very simply the number of units that could be built under a certain zoning scheme. So today, the vast majority of land in town is zoned for single family houses. So if you are in an A zone and you have 40,000 square feet of land, the unit capacity of your property under our zoning is 1. You can build 1 house on that acre of land. If you're in an A zone and you have 20,000 square feet of land, your zone capacity is 0 because the minimum lot size is 40,000 square feet. You don't have enough. You have a zone capacity of 0. If you're in a C zone and you have a 40,000 square foot lot, your zone capacity is whatever 40,000 divided by 7,500 square feet is. 7,500 square feet is the minimum lot size in the C zone. So you could subdivide into multiple lots if you've got a big enough lot. And so your zone capacity is greater than 1. The diagram here kind of talks about duplexes. A duplex is just one building with 2 units in it. So, pretend that we've got a 2-family house in the town of Milton. When you're calculating the unit capacity of a parcel, you have to just pretend that there's nothing there, right? This is just an undeveloped parcel, whether it has a single family house or a 2-family house or an apartment tower on it, pretend it's blank. And then you have to think, okay, under a new zoning scheme, how many units could be built on this blank parcel? So, this becomes important because, people ask, well, can we get credit for, existing multifamily, or how many, net new units are we going to get, depending on where we go. And so it's important to understand that the zoning is kind of agnostic on what's actually there right now, and is only concerned with how much could you potentially build under the new zoning. And the other thing that's, extraordinarily important to remember is that MBTA communities Section 3A is a zoning mandate. It's not a production mandate. So if we create compliant zoning and then a single new unit is not produced ever, we're still compliant. If they say that, we've checked all our boxes and we've created compliant zoning, it doesn't matter if anything actually gets produced. Now, the likelihood of that happening is pretty slim. Something will get produced, but there is no one is compelling the town to do anything besides create the zoning in order to encourage new housing to be built. And I say it's really important to remember this, because a lot of times I'll be at a public forum and people will be like, well, what happens if no one builds anything? Then we're going to do eminent domain and we're going to take people's land and build apartments on it. We're not going to do that. There's nothing requiring the town to do anything besides pass the zoning and then let individual property owners decide whether they want to redevelop or not redevelop. The town will sort of be out of it at that point once the zoning is created. Obviously, we've got to issue building permits and do site plan approval, but that's kind of standard stuff. And that's another thing to kind of keep in mind is we're required to create by right zoning, but there are other things that we're still allowed to do. So, if you follow the planning board at all, the planning board has a process called site plan review. And what site plan review is basically meant for is projects and proposals that are allowed by zoning, but are kind of, more complex or just different than a single family house. And so our requirements are basically any multifamily project is subject to site plan review, and any commercial project is subject to site plan review. And that's basically giving the planning board an opportunity to kind of evaluate the physical impacts of a project that maybe, again, is, the building code, can handle single family houses. But once you get bigger than that, you need a little bit more of a closer review, a more kind of detailed request for information on the part of developers. So we're allowed to do that. We're also allowed to require 10% affordability. A lot of folks are concerned about affordable housing. We are allowed to include a 10% requirement of what they call inclusionary zoning. The state is capped at 10%. They don't want to see towns requiring 20, 25, 30% because that renders projects financially unfeasible and kind of undercuts the sort of the purpose of the law. So they've kind of set that level, like sort of 10%. Keep up with 40B if you're already there. Maybe you can grab a few units, but we're allowed to do that and still be considered compliant. So that's another important thing to keep in mind.
Kim, can these 40Bs be put under the zoning?
What was that?
Can all the new 40Bs that are out there, can they be thrown into the MBTA zoning?
So what you would need to do is, and we're actually looking at this on Randolph Ave, is you would have to, so the answer is it depends. Because you have to, if you were to create a sub-district that includes one of the 40B projects, it's got to be at least 5 acres, right? And so you'd have to look at each of those projects and say, okay, does this add up to 5 acres? I don't have the data on my fingertips. A couple of them are on pretty big parcels, but I don't know if any of them are 5 acres on their own. So you would need to create a bigger district. The other thing that you would need to make sure that you do is don't create zoning that is more attractive than the 40B project itself, right? So if you've got a 40B project that, is already at, 20 units per acre, because we are zoning multiple sub-districts and need to get to a overall density of 15 units per acre, some of the sub-districts we're looking at need to be much bigger than 15 units per acre to account for sub-districts that are smaller than 15 units per acre. And so, it's not as simple as just sort of drawing a line around a 40B project and calling it a day, because if you do zoning that is, more permissive than the 40B project itself, then what you have the potential for is they throw away the 40B project and then come in and get a building permit for a much bigger project under your by right zoning. And so it's a very kind of careful calibration that you need to do. But we are actually looking at the 728 Randolph Ave parcel and seeing if we can kind of create a zoning district around that. Because, and this is another important thing to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we look at the maps, but I'll give you a great example. 88 Wharf is 73 units or 78. Let's say it's 78 units. That's a relatively new building. It's owned by a condo association. Each of the individual unit owners owns, their portion of the building. That was created via special permit. That building is currently, I think the density is something like 35 units per acre. It's 78 units on a little bit more than 2 acres. So we're going to draw a zoning subdistrict that includes 88 Wharf. And that zoning will be for maybe, let's say, 40 units per acre. So 88 Wharf will have new zoning underneath it. We will get credit for however many units of unit capacity for that zoning. And the probability of a new development happening at 88 Wharf is infinitesimal. Again, it's a relatively new building. It's in great shape. It's a lovely building. The idea that the condo association would decide to demolish their own building and chase a slight increase in density is comical, right? So there are opportunities for us to effectively, take credit for stuff that we've already done. And that's kind of how it's done. And we'll show that a little bit more detail when we look at the maps. But I want to just kind of get through a little bit of this because we're going to get into the really exciting stuff. But, these are the variables that we need to satisfy, at least 50 acres, zone capacity of 2461 units, overall density of 15 units per acre.
Tim,
so
on 40B, so this 2461, it's fair to assume that none of them are going to be affordable, right? And so this is going to create a need for us to create more 40B to accommodate that. Have you crunched any numbers? Like if we do the maximum 2461 units, do you have an idea of how many additional 40B units Milton would be required to build against that?
So I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say that none of them will be affordable, because if we go to the limit of what we're allowed to do in the zoning, we can require at least 10% of any of these units to be affordable, right? So there are implications for that. So if you want to, and we'll see this in a little bit.
Let's just go to, let's go to like 2,200. If we have to go to 2,200, how many 40Bs would we have to put online against, like, say, 2,200?
So we haven't done the math on that, but the other thing to keep in mind is that, again, the 2461 is a zoning mandate. It is a guarantee, a 100% guarantee that we will not see 2461 units be built under this zoning ever. Because you have to understand that we are going to be zoning many, many different properties that have very different likelihoods of redevelopment, either based on their location or based on their ownership or based on their current condition, or, depending on where we zone, if we're zoning along Elliott Street, for instance, which is, a potential possibility, then you're talking about hundreds of potential property owners making hundreds of different, redevelopment decisions. The thing that I like to tell people is, if you go back and read, newspaper accounts of our 1938 zoning, you'll see them talk about creating zoning in Milton, which largely still exists today, that would have a zone capacity for 50 to 70,000 Miltonians, right? That's our full build out under our current zoning, which we haven't even come close to. So, there's all sorts of reasons why, there's a target number of 2461, but the likelihood of actually those units coming online and the pace of them coming online is kind of unknown. So, you could do that math and kind of figure that out. But ultimately the timeline that we're talking about is, it's undeniable. We're going to have to create more, SHI eligible units, but we have to do that anyway. And so, the level at which that happens, I think we're going to avail ourselves of the 10% inclusionary requirement so that we can at least keep our heads above water. But you can never inclusionary zone your way out of 40B. You've got to allow 40B projects to be built. So, we can try to estimate that, but, the timeline under which that happens is kind of, really tough to tell.
Tim, what's the ratio to put affordable housing on to new stock? So we put 15 new houses in the town. How many?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear any of that.
If we say someone comes in and builds 20 units in the neighborhood of new housing, how many affordable housing units for 40B do we have to have per that 20? There has to be a ratio somewhere.
Well, so, if it's created under the zoning and we decide to do 10%, so 2 of those units in that project would be affordable units. How many additional 40? What was that?
With our current zoning laws, per new housing unit, what's the percentage of affordable housing that has to be built as we stand today?
That's a complicated question. So, the other really important thing to understand is that under our current zoning, which by and large only allows single family houses, we're not building any affordable housing. The only way that we're getting affordable housing is 40B projects.
Yeah, but if a new house is built, ticks that number up. What's the multiplier for new construction to 40B units? There has to be a metric somewhere that isn't a huge problem. It's per 20 units, it's 0.8 affordable housing units.
I'd have to go back and do that math. So I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Tim, do you know if anybody has fought this, this was the last governor who put this in on his way out, right? And then fled. Has any other communities come in and just said, this is not?
It's the state legislature that passed the law.
Okay. So is anybody fighting this?
So far, and it's tough to say because, each of these different types of communities have different deadlines. Mm-hmm. The rapid transit communities have the earliest deadline for compliance, which is December 31st, 2023. Yep. That's a date where we'll see, if any of those 12 communities are in compliance or not. A lot of towns are, playing ball. I know the town of Holden has famously kind of, explicitly said, we're just not doing it. They've already been sued by a civil rights group on fair housing grounds. So they're the highest profile one so far. I think no other town, Middleborough was kind of talking for a little bit. Marshfield was talking for a little bit, but I think everyone by and large has kind of, if they harbor really strong feelings about not complying, they're not talking about it much publicly. So, the rubber's going to hit the road at those compliance deadlines, the first of which is December 31, 2023.
And Tim, I'm sorry, but is there an opportunity to file an extension for that deadline, or is that set in stone? Do we know?
We could ask, but I think the question becomes, what do you need the extension for?
I just feel like
how much time do you think that you need?
These things tend to go away. You know what I mean? Like when a lot of people are traveling, you have June, July, August, people are out of school, kids are out of school, people are traveling. It's, you lose some time. That's my only concern.
I would think the extent.
My directive from the select board, I work for the select board, is, to pursue compliance, by the deadline. But ultimately, town meeting is the decision maker. So if for whatever reason the zoning is not satisfactory to town meeting for, either fundamental ideological reasons or because, they think it needs more work or needs to be adjusted, that'll be the decision maker, in December, whether or not town meeting decides that they want to pass the zoning or not. In which case, it's not necessarily an extension, but, we will have to go back to the drawing board, with, that input and that data from town meeting if they decide not to vote for it. But, as of right now, my directive has been to, pursue compliance and, help the planning board, help the select board, help the town kind of figure this stuff out.
Thank you.
And Tim, you submitted an action plan in or around January. Is that
Yes.
true? So like so this is underway. This is happening. Like we are on track for compliance.
Yeah, it's going to be hard work, but the
and it is
the
a lot.
action plan.
And Tim, we want to recognize that. We do recognize that you have put in a tremendous amount of work on this. It's phenomenal.
No, and I think ultimately, my kind of position here is, I want to get the stuff in front of people and not talk about the kind of meta ancillary stuff, but let's talk about the zoning and kind of figure out if it works or it doesn't work. And ultimately, the way that the law works is just like any other zoning law. And if town meeting doesn't want to do it, town meeting is not going to do it. And so I think, getting it in front of town meeting becomes really important. So the next couple slides show some of the districts that we've been testing. I mentioned that the state has produced this software model that allows you to sort of input, geographic information system data about geographies that you want to test, and it allows you to put in zoning parameters, and it'll tell you, do you hit your compliance metrics or not? So the first set of districts or sub-districts, I should say, that we're looking at are what we call kind of the large parcels. And I mentioned earlier, one of the fundamental things that we're kind of are guiding us is non-residential parcels or parcels that already have multifamily on them or are large or commercial or undeveloped. And so you've got this sort of crudely drawn diagram here that shows, we're looking at the large parcels in Milton Village and Central Ave. We're looking at Unquity House, which is the large multifamily building across the river from Mattapan Square, Brush Hill Road, Neponset Valley Parkway, Fuller Village, and the Brush Hill Rehabilitation Center. These are large parcels that have either existing multifamily or sort of non-residential uses. Randolph Ave, the A. Thomas and Sons property, and the Animal Rescue League property that's kind of behind those, again, represent large non-residential parcels. And then on Granite Ave, this sub-district is a little bigger than it actually is because it includes some marshland that we're no longer including in the zoning district for reasons that I can explain, but don't worry about it. But this district would include 2 Granite Ave, the Flatley office building, the state DPW yard, kind of park and ride lot, and then the American Legion Hall, which again, large parcels, non-residential, places where you can build kind of credible multifamily buildings. And so what we've done is identify these geographies and then put in some really basic zoning parameters and see, does this get us to compliance or not? Was there a question?
Yeah, is the old paper mill site taken off of that? 'Cause I believe that's 7 acres, isn't it?
So that's actually less than 7 acres. I think the paper mill site is something like 4 acres.
Which is
And the
reasonable
problem
size.
with that,
It doesn't
sorry?
have to be 5 acres, it has to be of reasonable size, so why aren't we using it?
Because it's not 5 acres.
It says of reasonable size or 5 acres. There's 2 different parameters there. One says the law says reasonable size, and then the guidance says 5 acres. There's 2 different things.
So
to be able to use both.
if we submitted that as a sub-district, HLC would look at the size of the sub-district and say, this isn't 5 acres, this is not a compliant sub-district.
But it's not the law, that's guidance.
The law empowers the housing agency to create guidelines to judge compliance.
I'd rather challenge that.
That's down the road.
there's, if we were to pursue that, I don't know what the recourse is when HLC says it's not compliant. I mean, the recourse would typically be you go back and you draw a compliant district. But if we're going to insist that we want to use that, then, again, I don't know where that ends us up at, except in court against the state.
Could the question
So,
be asked?
again, it's kind of, it speaks towards, trying to follow the compliance guidelines so that you don't end up in that position.
No, I get that, but can the question be asked? Can this be used? Because we're starved for land as it is. And every rule has an exception.
I think we're trying to look at areas where we fit the guidelines without having to ask for exceptions, because again I think the state is going to be very stingy when it comes to relief from these guidelines, because again, you have to understand there are 12 cities and towns with deadlines this December, and then there's another 163 after that. And so, this first set of towns coming in is really kind of precedent setting for the state. And so, my instinct here is that, they're going to want people to follow the guidelines as closely as possible.
So a lot of this is done by assumption. We don't have any real rule.
I can't say this more than I've said it. The state law empowers the housing agency to create guidelines. The state housing agency is the people who are going to judge our zoning for compliance or not. And so we're following the guidelines. And I haven't gotten a directive from anybody to do otherwise.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll try to run through this really quick because, it's a little bit of a fluid situation as we start to, we'll do these tests, we'll get the results, and then we'll see, the unit capacity is really high or it's really low. And, we'll start to make, adjustments based on that. But this is kind of what this stuff looks like. The inputs are, what is your minimum lot size in your zoning? How many parking spaces per dwelling unit? What is your building height? What is your lot coverage? So these are the things you're punching into the model. And in kind of the real world, what you're basically saying is, I'll give, Milton Hill House as an example over here at 36 Elliott Street. Here's a parcel that has a sort of aging apartment building on it, really big parking lot. At a density of 40 units per acre for that, approximately, several, I think it might be a 2 or 2.5 acre site. How many units can go on there under these zoning parameters? And so this is what the model spits out. And, a couple of the numbers that become important there are the multifamily unit capacity number. So we would get 597 units out of this zoning district if we did it, under these parameters, at a dwelling units per acre of almost 75 dwelling units per acre, which is really good. If you have 75 units per acre in an area where you think you can handle it, that allows you to do a lower density elsewhere. And the reason why I say that is because we set the dwelling units per acre at 40 units per acre, and that mirrors 131 Elliott Street, the Hendry's project, which is on 1 acre of land, and it's got 38 units in it. So that was a special permit project. That was something that the town, felt, all right, we can tolerate that in this area. It's not fully sold out yet, but it's up, it's there. We're going to start to kind of see how that, exists, in the neighborhood. But, we sort of mirrored that for all of the other parcels. And so under those parameters, we get a unit capacity of 597. Now, are 597 units going to be built here? Absolutely not. You've got 88 Wharf Street, not going to be redeveloped. 131 Elliott Street is a brand new building, not going to be redeveloped. 36 Central, brand new building, not going to be redeveloped. 50 Elliott Street, brand new building, not going to be redeveloped. So, this is when we say, taking credit for what we've already done. We don't have a ton of multifamily in town, but we're trying to, get credit for it in the sense of we will get a unit capacity number out of those parcels, but we won't have the impact of new units. We'll just have the units that we already have. So I'm going to try to blow through these pretty quickly just to kind of show you the geographies. and kind of what the final results are. 6-story building at Unquity House. This is an example of Unquity House is not on a 5-acre parcel. So we were able to fold in some additional single family house lots to get to 5 acres. And the implication for that is, the multifamily unit capacity under these zoning parameters is 161. But because all of these parcels are below the minimum lot size, those count towards the land area in the dwelling unit per acre calculation, but they don't give us any units for unit capacity. So, when we talk about this in the 40B context of your denominator is your land area and your numerator is your affordable units, this is the same sort of situation. Your denominator is how physically big is your zoning district, and your numerator is what is the zone capacity. So, we were talking earlier about the paper mill site. One of the reasons why we can't do this on the paper mill site is the paper mill site is isolated and it's surrounded by state land, which you can't zone for, doesn't count towards your land area. So since that parcel is not 5 acres on its own, it just becomes impossible to use as a potential zoning district. Again, Brush Hill Road, the 2 Fuller Village parcels plus the Brush Hill Rehabilitation Center. I want to just flag something for you all, just to kind of show you that we're paying attention to this stuff. Is under the parameters that we put in, which is a really enormous minimum lot size and a high dwelling units per acre, but not that high. It's 20 as opposed to 40 in Milton Village. We got a multifamily unit capacity of 1,324 units on these sites under these parameters. Which everyone agrees is way too much. So this is a situation where, we see maybe the location is okay for multifamily housing, big parcels, already existing multifamily, the likelihood of redevelopment, relatively low, but we have to change the parameters because we don't want 1,300 units down here. Even if it's a long shot, we don't want 1,300 units. And so this is one area where we're trying to play with these metrics a little bit to reduce that number. And that's something you can do in these scenario tests. You can adjust different parameters, minimum lot size, units per acre, lot coverage, to sort of get to a number that you're more comfortable with. Similar situation on Randolph Ave, non-residential parcels, relatively big parcels, 20 units per acre, 130,000 square foot minimum lot size, gets you to 280. So you can kind of see what we're trying to do on these parcels where, these are big parcels. We're anticipating, probably multiple decent sized apartment buildings. We set a building height of 2.5 stories over here, again, because we don't want big apartment towers, on Randolph Ave. So what you would probably see here under these zoning parameters is, a small campus of, smaller 2.5-story buildings in this scenario. But again, is 280 the right number over there? We haven't heard a ton of comments about this property, but, I think what we're trying to do is have any given subdistrict have the lowest possible density that it can and still allow us to hit our numbers. And then finally, Granite Ave. Granite Ave is probably, a lot of people would consider it to be the most appropriate place for some greater density. There is a residential neighborhood over there, but, 2 Granite Ave is very isolated and, it's got, good highway access and, all of that. So, that's something where, you set a building height of 6 stories, not a lot of other zoning parameters. You can get, 483, you can get upwards of 500, 600 units there if you wanted. But again, maybe that might be too much for Granite Ave. And so it becomes a balance between, if you reduce the density on one spot, you're going to have to increase it somewhere else in order to maintain that equilibrium of 15 units per acre.
Hey, Tim.
So, yeah.
Tim, sorry, it's Lori. Back to Granite Ave. Isn't that state owned, some of that?
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing in the guidelines because generally speaking, you can't zone for state land, and you really can't zone for town land either unless you have evidence of, we're trying to dispose of this land for housing purposes. So we couldn't zone, town hall, because we're not Town hall's not going anywhere. And so that wouldn't count. The exception is if you have a piece of publicly owned land, usually state-owned land, that is identified as a strategic housing site in your housing production plan, you can include that in your zoning district. And fortunately, we had the foresight to identify the state DPW yard as a potential housing site in our housing production plan. I mean, folks remember as recently as 2014, the state kind of floating that property as, a potential development site. They eventually pulled it back, but that kind of put it in our minds like, at any point the state could be, disposing of this land. And so, we could zone for it. Governor Healy has also said, and Governor Baker before her, wanting to put a priority on using state-owned property for housing, development purposes. And so that's why we felt comfortable zoning for the state DPW yard.
But couldn't you then add a little bit more acreage over by the paper mill that's state-owned and just expand that to get you to the 5 acres?
So there's no state-owned land around the paper mill site that is in the housing production plan as a strategic housing site. That's all part of the Neponset River Reservation, which is considered to be excluded land. You can't zone on it. Okay. So that's another reason, the paper mill is in a kind of unique situation because it's just not, it doesn't abut anything else except for unzonable state land.
Tim?
Yes.
Thank you. I have my hand raised, by the way. I have a question. When you added the large parcel test with your little zones in red crayon, you included Fuller Village. Now, Fuller Village, as we know, is age restricted, and it's a nonprofit setup for Fuller Village. How would you be able to, and if I could add in 30 Curtis,
yep,
is actually owned by the town for age restricted affordable housing for seniors. How are you able to add, say, Fuller Village, and then in another district, 30 Curtis, knowing that nothing can be, and they're not going to tear down Fuller Village. And I don't think, in all reality, 30 Curtis building is going to disappear because it is part of the town's affordable senior housing plan, much the same as 600 Canton. So how is it that you're adding Fuller Village just to get the acreage for the number of units, knowing full well you can't really demolish Fuller Village and build for all types of age housing?
So there's a couple things that work here, and it's a good question. Just for clarity, also, Unquity House, 30 Curtis Road, is actually not owned by the town. That's owned by Milton Residence for the Elderly. But
okay.
Similar to sort of the Fuller housing group, it's a mission-based housing developer, interested in building senior housing. So huge asset to the town. We love those folks. The thinking behind those districts is, we're required to zone for areas. We're not required to build anything. And the zoning is really as far as it goes. So there are going to be areas where we have to zone places, and there's a likelihood that we're going to see new development, which in a lot of ways is really good, and in some ways, could be not so good. And so I think we're trying to achieve a balancing act of modulating the time frame of the impacts of new housing, where there are certain development sites that are likely to be redeveloped soon. There are development sites that are probably not going to be redeveloped soon. And then there are development sites that, may never be redeveloped in our lifetimes, And so when you look at Fuller Village, that's probably an area where, again, Fuller Village is not brand new, but it's not old either. This is good quality housing, and if there's 300 something units on those two parcels, and we rezone for 500 or 600 units, even if we go that high, again, the likelihood of the Fuller Housing Corporation saying, all right, we're going to tear down our existing nice facility and rebuild it for a handful of extra units. Again, that's a relatively low likelihood. Now, there may be a time, decades from now, where that housing is no longer that new. And they may want to avail themselves of their zoning and say, we want to rebuild our facility, and now we can do this by right and put additional units on. And that's something that they can do in sort of the long-term future.
If I may add that they're under age restriction.
Right.
At Fuller Village. So if I may think that decades from now, seniors will no longer need, housing. I don't think so. I think there'll still be a need. But in order to get around the age restricted, they would have to nullify their whole complex as age restricted to come into compliance.
So let me, and this is my fault for not addressing this earlier when we talked about age restrictions. So the law says that you can't mandate an age restriction, right? So if we were to put together zoning that said only 55 plus, they would say you're not compliant. If you are a developer of age restricted housing, you could absolutely use the zoning. So you can't mandate it, but there's also no prohibition of age restricted housing. So it's the same as anything else. The land that Fuller Village is on didn't used to be age restricted housing land. It used to be something else entirely, and they went and they built age restricted housing on it. So the zoning has to allow for non-age restricted housing, but it also doesn't necessarily have to preclude it. So if the Fuller Housing Corporation wanted to hold on to that land and redevelop it decades in the future, they could absolutely still build senior housing, affordable housing, whatever they want as the property owner. Now they could also, sell the land to another developer and, make a tidy profit and kind of walk off into the sunset. I suspect they won't do that. They're a mission-based organization. They're interested in maintaining and operating, senior affordable housing. And so I suspect that they'll do that. So the zoning can't mandate it, but it also doesn't prohibit it. And the same goes for Unquity House. I happen to think that Unquity House, as an older building, and also the site plan at Unquity House has a lot of parking. There's a lot of kind of just empty land over there. I think that may actually be, a more medium-term redevelopment site. And again, Milton Residence for the Elderly owns that property. They could decide to avail themselves of their new zoning and build a new, senior affordable housing facility over there. And I think that's a really important thing to understand about the zoning is that when you allow by right multifamily zoning, you open up the possibilities for, now, in all likelihood, the majority of any housing that gets built is going to be market rate developers coming in. But, currently, the only people that are building affordable housing in the town of Milton are MRE, Fuller Housing, and 40B developers. When you create multifamily zoning, any property owner could decide, I want to build affordable housing here. And sort of they don't have that added step of, we've got to spend a year getting zoning through town meeting and then another year in a special permit process. That's money for developers. And so when you create a streamlined zoning process, it opens up the opportunities for more types of developers, including some of those mission-based developers to come in. So that was my fault for not clarifying that earlier.
Could I do a follow-up? So take 30 Curtis or Unquity House, whichever you want to call it. That huge parking lot is really never full, ever. So could they mix use that property, leave the 30 Curtis as their affordable senior housing, which is different than Fuller Village. It's not affordable senior housing down at Fuller Village. And then build another building comparable in size perhaps to 30 Curtis already in existence, and then have that as a multi-use. Geez, on that one property, you could have an age-restricted building and a non-age restricted building on the site that is 30 Curtis.
You could potentially, but what you would need to look at in that case is, does the zoning create a maximum dwelling units per acre on that site? And, how many additional units could you build on that site with the existing, senior housing already there? And so that may be a situation where, if there's 130 units there today and the new zoning allows for 160 units, is the juice worth the squeeze to do a new development?
30 units,
Yeah. So, it all really depends on what the ultimate, parameters are at the end.
May I make sort of an observation then after this? I was focused on these age-restricted parcels. That in your charts, it shows must maybe also add, but can also. But how would you do your chart to indicate and help educate the people that are trying to grasp all this information that what you just said, it doesn't exclude age restriction either? How would you change your chart to help get that message out?
I don't know, but I should, because it's an important message. I'll have to figure that out. It's a question that hasn't come up because we haven't necessarily been talking about specific geographies yet. But now that we're starting to get into that, we're starting to hear that question a little bit more. And so, we'll figure out a way to make sure that that's kind of front and center in our future presentations.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Yep. So just to wrap up,
Sir?
in the situations that we tested
Tim,
with
Tom
those
has a
sub-districts.
question. Tom, you have a question?
Yes.
I did. Hi, Mr. Sawinski. I just had a question before you moved on from the large parcel slides. I just had a question just about two of them. Really quickly, the District 4 parcel on Randolph Ave, that's a commercially owned property, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How did that particular parcel come to the town's attention to be rezoned?
So again, one of the guiding principles that we had was what are existing large parcels, what are existing non-commercial parcels, and then do they fit the parameters for size in terms of a 5 acre or greater sub-district. And so once you go through all of those parameters, you start to peel away a lot of a lot of parcels. The paper mill site, we looked at the paper mill site, we're not able to get a compliant sub-district out of that. There's the Salamondo construction yard on Blue Hill Ave, which is again, large-ish parcel, non-residential. It's kind of, industrial construction property. But again, that's maybe 2.5, 3 acres tops. In order to get a compliant sub-district out of that, for instance, you'd be folding in a lot of single-family houses. And, what we're trying to do is, we may be compelled to zone in single-family neighborhoods along Elliott Street, perhaps. But if we can get away with it, we don't want to do that. And so, this is a situation where, large parcel, commercial, the Animal Rescue League parcel behind it is just blank, vacant. I mean, it's effectively part of the reservation, but it's not technically part of the reservation at that point. So, this was just something where, it checked a couple boxes, it fit the parameters. And so we wanted to see what would happen, if we zoned for it and how it would fit into the kind of greater collection of sub-districts that we were testing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And then and the reason I asked this is just because I know there are a lot of properties like this. This is a commercial property. It could be sold very easily. So I expect a big development up here on Randolph Ave, which is a very dangerous road, the rotary coming in. And that's why I just asked that particular question, because it was unique to me and how it became part of the presentation, just because it is a commercial property. And the next
Yeah,
one
and-
was the next slide, Mr. Swilinski. It's just the District 5 slide, which incorporates the VFW and the Public Works Yard for the Commonwealth, correct?
Yes.
And I was just wondering, we talked, you had said earlier, and this kind of spawns this question about how some of these properties will not be developed or very unlikely to be developed. As a Precinct 6 resident, I can very easily see the VFW selling to an out-of-state company for millions of dollars. I can also see the Mass DPW yard being unloaded by the state. And I guess, these are all questions that we don't know, but that would be my concern, especially in this area up against 93. People from their apartment could look to 93 and not probably walk to Cedar Grove, certainly not North Quincy. So the last mile, so to speak. So, I think that, this parcel, using your words, a sloppy development, this is something that comes to mind, and also the Randolph Ave parcel. So, and I know this is just initially, you've done a ton of work on this, and I don't mean to criticize. I'm just trying to think it through myself, especially as to these two parcels. So
yeah, I mean, I think those are all good observations and things that we've kind of thought of, and sure. Ultimately, again, you can draw a 5-acre line around anywhere in town and try to make sub-districts with parameters that make sense. We try to impose some kind of basic criteria on parcels. I think ultimately, we want to be aware of the impacts of development, especially large scale multifamily development. But you can only hide so much. If the state is compelling you to create zoning, you're eventually going to create zoning that may lead to some multifamily housing being developed. Yeah. And so where you've got these larger parcels, there's the opportunity to allow for some more creative site planning. Some more kind of, flexibility in terms of circulation and kind of getting on and off the sites, that doesn't maybe necessarily exist in, again, the Elliott Street corridor, which is in the transit zone and is kind of, the most densely kind of developed part of town. And so, there are virtues and vices to all of these things. I think Randolph Ave is just dreadful. And it's kind of a black eye for the state that it's been allowed to be in the condition that it's in for so long in terms of, safety and speed. And so that's something that I think we need to think critically about. On the one hand, there's land that works. On the other hand, do you really want to have a lot of development over here? And I think these are still open questions. I think Granite Ave is a slightly different case. Granite Ave is definitely a tough street. But I think that there are opportunities to sort of, get people on the highway and just get them out. To Granite Ave is a slightly different story than the state DPW yard. I would not walk to Cedar Grove from the state DPW yard, but, potentially someone could conceivably, hop on their bike and either, get on the trail from there and kind of get to one of the Mattapan line stations, or, again, they're kind of right there on the highway. So, there, like I said, there are virtue and vices to all of these. And I think ultimately, we're going to be looking at, a number of sub-districts and, have to, as a town, through the planning board, through the public process that we're trying to run, we are in the process of, I sent a letter last week to all town meeting members, asking them to keep an eye on this stuff. The planning board is putting a mailer out in everyone's water bill. So, by October, November, everyone in town will, if they open their water bill, we'll have some information on MBTA community zoning. So we're trying to get people into this process and start to weigh these issues and try to figure out, where's the best place to do this stuff.
Tim, I really appreciate that. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to ask a bunch of questions, but I was trying to ask questions and I was messing up the microphone. So this is
that's why I'm here. No worries.
This is my last one, really. And it's kind of like an overall question, because when I think of transit-oriented developments, I started hearing about them like in the 90s. I think of like that you walk to the train station. And with these parcels, we're not doing that. And you made a comment earlier about it, but when I look at the map where you can walk to Milton or Central, that's great. and encompasses all that area by Elliott Street. So I'm thinking, that is a true transit-oriented development, or how it's supposed to work, where you just walk. And we're creating zones to spread it out. And that is a concern, especially a concern for people in East Milton, I think, when they look at Granite Ave, the possibilities of this. So I think if a hypothetical, I guess, would be if we're going to go this route of spreading it out, which at this point I don't think is the meaning of the legislation at all. I would assume, and I would trust, that some of the more denser development would occur within that quarter mile to a half mile of the physical stations. And the less would perhaps be the ones that are much farther away. Like I said, just a hypothetical, if you understand my comment.
This is a fundamental question that the town needs to answer. And I say the town because I don't think it should be me, first of all. And I don't even necessarily think it should be, the planning board, quite frankly, because this is the issue. Do we want to concentrate development in the transit area, which, if you look at the kind of the black letter of the law is what it's about, or do we want to take advantage of the flexibility that the state has granted us to not concentrate all of that development in one relatively small geography? We have been trying to test both of those options. We've got initial tests on, these are not the only sub-districts that we've tested. We'll get to a couple more in a minute. But our technical assistance providers that are, have expertise in running this model are going to be providing us, effectively with, what does compliance look with the large parcels, based on the input and feedback we've gotten from the planning board, and what does compliance look like incorporating more of the transit zone. And so we'll get to that right now. And this is just sort of the summary of these tests. So, again, technically, we've got compliant districts here because we have zoning for 2,845 units. The district size is above the minimum, and the density of the districts overall is 23.8, which is way greater than 15 units per acre. So technically, we could probably get some compliant districts here, and we'll be off to the races with the state. But that also includes, this Brush Hill Road district with 1,324 units, which we absolutely do not want. And maybe includes some densities that maybe we're not comfortable with. I think the point that the gentleman earlier just made, do we want to have, a little bit of density outside the transit area and kind of focus the density in the transit area? This doesn't necessarily do that. And so if you were to make those changes, maybe you would start to see these compliant kind of metrics go away. And so that means that we also need to look at the entire transit area itself. So again, this is the half-mile radius around all of these stations. The blue parcels are within the half mile. The white parcels are not. So when we initially tested this area, and if you either live here or have visited here, that, in the north and the west of this district is among the most sort of densely developed areas of town. It's a C zone, 7,500 square foot minimum lot size. In reality, almost this entire neighborhood predates zoning. And so these are more akin to 5,000, 6,000 square foot lots. And so if you were going to create zoning in this area, you can't do what we're trying to do on the big parcels. You can't zone for 20, 30, 40, units in an apartment building because you physically can't fit them in. One thing about the compliance model, which again is the state software tool that they're going to use to judge compliance, is it doesn't take into account lot consolidation and it doesn't take into account subdivision. So if you have, in the real world, if you set a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size, somebody could buy 2 adjacent 5,000 square foot lots and then have a compliant lot. The model is not assuming that. The model is looking at your parcels as they exist today and telling you do you have unit capacity on those parcels or not? And so that has implications because on the one end, the pink parcels that are shaded here are parcels that are below 5,000 square feet. And we've identified 5,000 square feet as really the smallest possible parcel where you could fit a multifamily building, which is, according to state statute, 3 or more units. So effectively think, a 3-family house on a 5,000 square foot lot. So any of these pink parcels are non-compliant. You can't build anything here because they're less than 5,000 square feet. On the other end of the spectrum, you have these yellow lots, which are big lots. In sort of Milton Hill and the Columbines, the A and B zones over here, you've got 20,000, 40,000, 80,000 square foot lots. And again, because the model is not taking subdivision into account, if you set a minimum lot size of, say, 10,000 feet, and say, if you've got 10,000 feet, you can build a 4-unit house. I'll use Hutchinson Field as an example. It's a bad one because you actually can't build on Hutchinson's Field. But, Hutchinson's Field gets a zoned capacity of 4 units, even though it's enormous. All of these parcels that are acre or more, we've got a sub-acre minimum lot size, but we're only getting credit for 4 units on any of these parcels because, again, the model is not taking subdivision into account. And so, again, if you think about that math problem about how you get to overall density, you've got your unit capacity in the numerator, and you've got your overall land area in the denominator. And so these pink and yellow parcels are really dragging your density down. When we tested this, we tested some really basic, really low density scenarios in this entire area, and we got to an overall density of like 8 units per acre, which is, a little bit more than half of where we need to be. And so if you want to zone in this area, you need to start to change things, and so what we start to look at is, all of those formerly pink and yellow parcels are now ghosted out in this. And we've kind of shrunk the transit area district to really include as many developable parcels as possible, and not parcels that either can't be developed or are just basically not contributing enough to your overall density. And so, we did the exercise of kind of shrinking that. And then just based on kind of like the street configuration and the parcel size, we kind of created these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, sub districts. The dimensional parameters are not that different in any of these, but we did want to kind of just break them down into chunks based on, again, parcel size, parcel shape, street configuration. So these are areas that we're still, looking into. Do these need to be a part of our zoning districts or not? I think in terms of the pros and cons of development, when we talk about the large parcels, we try to target non-residential, big parcels where you could sort of build big apartment buildings. You wouldn't be, demolishing existing single family houses. You wouldn't be, in the middle of a single family neighborhood, and again, if you think about how closely the town treasures its physical character, that becomes really important. Obviously a new big multifamily building is going to be different than a lot of what you see in the town of Milton, but at least it's not cheek to jowl with just a bunch of tiny single family houses. That being said, there are benefits to zoning in this area. If we were to zone on Granite Ave, the minute that a developer purchases one of those parcels, within 2 years, you've got 200 units where 0 used to exist. And so the impacts of that are very quick and acute and concentrated in one very specific area. In a situation like, we're calling it the Elliott Street corridor, although it includes, other neighborhoods. If you rezone this area, like I said earlier, hundreds of property owners making hundreds of decisions whether to redevelop or not. And so the probability of any given parcel changing in any given year is actually relatively low. And the pace of change becomes slower. and the overall change in a neighborhood becomes more organic and more easily absorbed and easily kind of tolerated. We're not looking at these parcels and saying, okay, we want apartment buildings on Elliott Street. In fact, what we would be trying to do if we zone this area is take advantage of the existing nonconformities, where you've got, a driveway on either side, and you want to make sure you take advantage of the fact that, people aren't going to want to tear down a house and have to build in the center of their lot because they won't be able to fit a driveway in. So what we're hoping to do is create zoning in these areas, if we decide to do it, where an addition or, dormering out on the third floor or, doing something to sort of make an internal change to the house creates that 3-unit building as opposed to a tear down and, a new 3-family house going up. And so that would be something where we would kind of try to modulate those zoning parameters in this area. But again, it becomes a fundamental question of if you have the opportunity and the possibility of not zoning this area, which, again, includes tons of single family houses, also a National Register Historic District in Milton Hill, which again, folks may not want to kind of put at risk. Do you want to zone this in the first place? And again, it speaks to those pros and cons. This is transit oriented development. This is where the transit is. So if you want to concentrate development where the transit is, you may not have a choice. But if you want to spread those impacts out and maybe look elsewhere, then you start to look at some of those other sub-districts that we were looking at. And so, this is something we're going to be presenting some, what I'll call final options to the planning board, but, we'll see if there's more iterating to go on here. But, we've given a lot of feedback to our technical assistance providers, through our public forums, through our discussions at the planning board. And, we're trying to come up with options for compliance that I think, achieve a lot of those planning goals that, have been articulated in our previous efforts.
Tim?
Do we have some questions?
Yeah, just one quick one. Is the Farm Pond site in Laveray College included in any of this?
They are not included. Those are those are another type of parcel that the guidelines prohibit you from zoning. So educational facilities, churches, institutions. So we couldn't rezone Milton Hospital, for instance. We couldn't rezone Curry College.
Well, say Laveray doesn't get
again,
accreditation back. Does that change?
I think it becomes an open question. That would have to be an argument that we made to the state that we are zoning this area, in anticipation of the school not being a going concern anymore, which they may or may not decide to go with. But I think that is, if we decide that's something we want to do, I would have to look at the area and kind of see the acreage. Again, if it adds up to 5 acres, then great. If not, we'd have to start to fold in some other parcels around there, and you'd have to think about what the implications of that for zoning are.
Tim, is it kind of fair to say that it looks to me like one of the ways of looking at this presentation here is that we kind of have a choice to boil it down, an A or B, the transit area sub-district framework, or the more dispersed zoning throughout the town? Is that kind of the presentation here? Is it we kind of got two ways of looking at it?
I wouldn't say it's A or B, yep. But it's maybe A, B, C, D, depending on, because, there's the other thing that, we haven't really talked about is East Milton. East Milton is going to be the subject of its own separate zoning process. We just kicked that off at the planning board last week. Stay tuned for that if you live in the area. And for that reason, we haven't really been talking about East Milton for the purposes of MBTA communities. But, there is an argument to be made that we're on a path towards rezoning in East Milton anyway. Why don't we fold it into MBTA communities, get credit for it, and then do the zoning that we actually want to do? Because the other thing about MBTA community zoning is the only thing the state is concerned with is meeting the minimum requirements in a by right zoning scheme. So one thing that you can do is create zoning that meets the minimum guidelines, and then create a special permit process over and above that where you can maybe give some extra density in exchange for more affordable housing, more mixed use, all of the goodies that we like to sort of do special permit zoning for. And so that's something where, maybe you want to include East Milton with the understanding that anything you do under the MBTA community scheme is probably going to be too low density to attract a lot of development, and people will want to develop under your special permit zoning. The other thing is there could be any of a combination of, maybe you want to not do Brush Hill Road and then you just do, 3 and 4 on this map. So I think it's less A or B and more, I think that question needs to be answered. And then based on that, you've got a sort of a menu of options that, you can try to figure out. Now, a lot of this is very integrated and very highly contingent upon, if you crank up the density in subdistrict 5, then maybe you can lower it somewhere else. Or if you lower it in Granite Ave, you've got to make up for that somewhere else. One thing that we're finding is of the metrics that we have to hit, there's a minimum size that is super easy to hit. We're going to be more than 50 acres no matter what. It's impossible not to. The overall zone capacity, we can get really close to 2461. It's the overall density of 15 units per acre that becomes the trickiest one, and the one that's kind of causing the most heartache in terms of, having to zone for places where maybe you wouldn't want to do as much density as you want. And the other thing I'll say is, every town is unique, but there's a lot of towns also that have the same kind of issues. The problem in Milton is really the area that is closest to transit is probably the least suitable for broad scale multifamily housing. I use the example of Dedham all the time. Dedham has one commuter rail station near Legacy Place. They're rezoning Legacy Place, putting a bunch of, zoning for apartment buildings on the parking lot. I think they're done, with this, so they had a really easy go of it. Whereas in Milton, in order to get to compliance strictly in the transit area, you're dramatically changing the physical character of the neighborhood in a way that a lot of people find to be just intolerable. And so we're kind of compelled to bring in all these other parcels and try to kind of work around this, again, fundamental issue of you just can't do a ton of high density development in this area because the parcels are so small. And, if you're interested in preserving the physical character of the neighborhood, you really have to look around and try to kind of solve for that. So long answer to your question, but it's not quite A and B, but, we're trying to really hone in on a discrete set of options so that we're not spending the rest of our lives, testing this and testing that. And that's kind of why we've kind of set some parameters on this stuff.
Do you have a sense of what the timeline is on East Milton? Because, there are ways that we can show that we have achieved interim compliance by taking affirmative steps, which we are. You see what I mean? I know that we've got to have this December 31, 2023 deadline to submit the district compliance application. But in good faith, if it's a significant issue with regards to the effect of East Milton Square on all this, do you have an idea of when those decisions are going to be addressed and possibly made?
On East Milton, this is something that the planning board is going to be talking about next week. We've asked our technical assistance providers to kind of include East Milton in the scenario testing that we're doing. And so that becomes, it's kind of in the conversation. But again, at what level do you zone East Milton, so that you're not undercutting, the other zoning process that you're doing? Does it actually help you to zone for East Milton? It could be, you zone for it at a certain level and it's actually bringing your overall density down. Then you may not want to do it. So I think, the other thing to kind of, keep in mind is, we need to maintain compliance, but it doesn't have to be the same compliance. And what I mean by that is, we may create a set of zoning districts that gets us to compliance in December, and then a year later kind of think better of it and say, actually, we don't want to have Brush Hill Road as part of, our package. And so we can always go back and amend that and then send that back to HLC and kind of check it off. We've got to maintain compliance, but the state really doesn't care, what form that takes, as long as you're checking all the boxes and kind of hitting all the, the minimum thresholds. And so, there may be a point where, we keep East Milton in and then we take it out and replace it with something else, or, vice versa. So this is the reality going forward, but, we can shape it, as long as we hit the minimum thresholds that the guidelines lay out.
Tim, what's the matter with Brush Hill Road? Whenever for the majority of you stay driving out of district, it's been Brush Hill Road. What's the matter with Brush Hill Road, and why is it always the first thing that you say you want to drop?
It's, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. Under the parameters that we have right now that kind of are part of an overall framework that kind of hits compliance, it requires a level of density that is intolerable. 1,324 units on Brush Hill Road in that section is just way too much. And so that may end up being a district where it's not contributing what it needs to contribute from an overall density perspective and may need to fall out. That being said, there may be other districts that also, fall out. It's really, there's nothing behind it except for it's the one that's on the tip of my tongue, at the moment. So, that's just something, I wouldn't say there's anything behind it.
Tim, just real quick, it's funny you were mentioning like Dedham, like they had a space that you could just, put a whole bunch of units in there and they're done. What about the golf course? That's huge, and a lot of it's on Milton. Did you guys look into rezoning the Milton section of the golf course?
So again, that is, although it's a golf course and it's leased by Granite Links, that is actually town-owned land. And again, you're prohibited from zoning town-owned land unless you can demonstrate that there's been a recent history of trying to dispose of it.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
What about Wollaston?
I don't know about Wollaston. I'll have to double check on what I think there's a guideline against zoning for that type of facility, but I'll have to double check on that.
What's the other golf course on the square?
I think one. I'll double check on that and get back to you all on
Thanks,
that one.
Tim. I'm not trying to play gotcha. It just occurred to me. Yeah, thank you.
No. I appreciate that, and again, I'm here to answer questions,
Right.
and this isn't a challenge or a threat.
Right.
I don't think I can be gotten on this because I've heard every single question.
Right.
But obviously, feel free to try if that's what you're interested in. I want to talk about noncompliance because it's something that's been coming up, ever since we started doing this process. So the statute lays out a penalty that is, if you're not compliant, you're not eligible for these 3 grant programs. In their guidelines, HLC has also said that they may take noncompliance into consideration in their discretionary grant programs. No details on that except for it's in the guidelines, and they haven't identified other grant programs. But these 3, Housing Choice Initiative, Local Capital Projects Fund, and MassWorks, are specifically named in the statute. And so we'll deal with those. Housing Choice Initiative is a program that incentivizes towns to engage in housing production strategies. So there's a certain, if you permit X number or X percentage of your existing housing stock for new housing in a given year, you sort of become a housing choice community. And then you have access to kind of exclusive capital grant programs, for building infrastructure projects. We've never been eligible for housing choice. And so, it is what it is. The Local Capital Projects Fund is actually a really previously unknown grant fund that's actually generated by casino revenue. And so a portion of casino revenue goes into the local capital projects fund. This is a different program from the other two because the other two programs are sort of application-based discretionary grant programs, whereas the local capital projects fund is appropriated every year by the legislature, and they do basically whatever they want with it. For the past 10 or so years, the local capital projects fund has been used as a way to supplement state subsidies to local housing authorities. And so of the three grant programs, the local capital projects fund is the one that we've actually benefited from the most, because a certain portion of the Milton Housing Authority's revenue comes from the state, and then a certain portion of the state's contribution to Milton Housing Authority comes out of the local capital projects fund. Depending on the year, it could be between $20,000 and $30,000. So that's something that
Annually?
is
Like, is that all?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Was there a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that it was 20 or 30,000 a year we would be likely to get from that.
In the recent past, yes, that's been around what the figure is.
Thank you.
Now, one thing that has kind of come up in the sort of conversation around these guidelines, and again, I say that the local capital projects fund was a relatively unknown grant program. A lot of folks, there was an interim compliance deadline in January. You had to submit an action plan, kind of outlining, what your plan to get to compliance was. And if you submitted a satisfactory plan, you're considered to be compliant. You're still eligible for all these grants. You can still get your capital projects fund contribution. There were several communities that didn't submit an action plan, and they got a letter from the state that basically said, your housing authority is now not going to get this money because you're not complying with the law. And that's what it is. And, a lot of people kind of felt that there was an injustice there where, the state is trying to promote housing development and kind of, help with housing affordability. And in the same breath is taking money away from local housing authorities. You can take different sides on this. It's a stick, it's a penalty in the law. And, the state legislators that created this law thought that it would be an effective, deterrent to noncompliance. On the other hand, it sucks to take money from local housing authorities, which overall, local housing authorities are not really a part of this zoning process. So it's kind of like pulling the rug from underneath them. The latest budget that was just signed by the governor last week, in its appropriation for the local capital projects fund, effectively creates a carve out that acknowledges, we're still going to give you the money, even if you're not compliant with MBTA communities, Section 3A. So effectively, the budget undercuts the law that the legislature passed in 2021. But, it is what it is. They made that decision. So this is a grant program that potentially could have been at risk with noncompliance, at least in the coming fiscal year. It's not at risk. And so that's kind of, an effect of the most recent budget cycle. MassWorks is kind of the biggest one of the grant programs, tens of millions of dollars a year in, just straight up infrastructure grants to cities and towns. This is right from the Commonwealth's website. Competitive grant program that provides the largest and most flexible source of capital funds to municipalities and other eligible public entities, primarily for public infrastructure projects that support and accelerate housing production, spur private development, and create jobs throughout the Commonwealth. That program is between $66 and $95 million a year that goes to, applicants, to this program. It's been around since I think 2010. We've only ever gotten one MassWorks grant since 2011, which is the latest data that I was able to find. The streetscape improvements that happened in Central Square or Central Ave, extending up Elliott Street into Milton Village, the brick on the sidewalks, the planters, the curbs, all of that was done with $1 million MassWorks grant.
$1 million?
Yes.
Was one. Thank you.
we have not been a big player in the MassWorks game. This is something where if, you got to be in it to win it. And to my knowledge, we have not submitted many applications for infrastructure projects. So, we've only gotten one. Typical similar sized towns, so like within 10% of our population, tend to have gotten, 2 awards worth $2.2 million in that same time period. So, we haven't applied for many grants. We probably could expect to have gotten another one in the time since 2011. But, again, not a situation where, I used to work in City of Boston and we would, consistently get half a dozen MassWorks grants for different projects just because there's a lot more going on.
But Tim, if
I'm
I'm just want to make sure I'm hearing this right because I'm new to this. So we're looking at a potential loss of $1,030,000 if we're not in compliance with this, right? Which could add in how many students for the public schools, which are
It's 1 million in the last 10 years.
in the last 10 years. Okay. Yeah. So just say it. Yeah. But right? Am I wrong? Am I looking at the math wrong?
You can look at the math a lot of different ways.
So if we added the students, we added the new kids, and then we're looking at, how many, all these additional housing units assume half of them have kids. Right? Or I'm not, okay. I just wanted to, Catholic school. I just want to make sure I'm on the, okay.
So we'll get to some of the fiscal impacts of this, or at least the potential fiscal impacts. But there are other things to kind of keep in mind about noncompliance. So these are the penalties that are laid out in the statute. But since then, both the governor and the attorney general have made pretty strong statements to the effect of our expectation is that towns are going to comply with this. And the thing about the law is the explicit language in the law is that, an MBTA community shall have a zoning district. It's not may have, or it's not we want them to have, it shall have. And so, if you're not, if you don't have a zoning district, you're in violation of Section 3A of Chapter 40A of the Mass General Laws. And so there are, unknown consequences that we won't know about until the compliance deadlines pass. One thing that we do know is this advisory from the Office of the Attorney General that came out. I think this was back in March, basically saying all MBTA communities must comply with the law. Communities that do not currently have a compliant multifamily zoning district must take steps outlined in the DHCD guidelines to demonstrate interim compliance. Communities that fail to comply with the law may be subject to civil enforcement action. Non-compliant MBTA communities are also subject to the administrative consequences of being rendered ineligible to receive certain forms of state funding. Importantly, MBTA communities cannot avoid their obligations under the law by foregoing this funding. The law requires that MBTA communities shall have a compliant zoning district and does not provide any mechanism by which a city or town may opt out of this requirement. MBTA communities that fail to comply with the law's requirements also risk liability under federal and state fair housing laws. The Massachusetts Anti-Discrimination Law and Federal Fair Housing Act prohibit towns and cities from using their zoning power for a discriminatory purpose or with a discriminatory effect. An MBTA community may violate these laws if, for example, its zoning restrictions have the effect of unfairly limiting housing opportunities for families with children, individuals who receive housing subsidies, people of color, people with disabilities, or other protected groups. So, this is the Attorney General of the Commonwealth effectively saying the state will take you to court if you're not compliant. Now, what that looks like, what that means, if and when it actually happens, how quickly is it going to happen? Is there going to be, leeway? These are all unknown things. But this is the strongest language we've had yet outside of the language of the law itself that, the executive branch intends to aggressively pursue and encourage compliance with this law. And so it's a big deal because, of the rapid transit communities and I'm part of periodic meetings with planners and officials from the 12 communities, everyone is racing to this deadline. Brookline, Newton, all of them are racing to the deadline to get to compliant zoning. And so, we are also racing, because it's coming up, and we certainly want to do what's best for the town. And a big part of that is not being non-compliant when, the music shuts off on midnight on January 1. And so we don't know what this will look like if it happens, but it's out there, and is a very, very strongly worded statement from the Attorney General's office. And so, when we talk about, what are we foregoing? Do we want to consider compliance? Do we have a choice? My opinion as a planning professional is there is no choice in the matter, because otherwise, we're in for a world of hurt from the Attorney General's office. So, that's why that's why we're out here, every 2 weeks at the planning board working on this stuff, every month, trying to get people involved in this process and get input on folks. So the chair talked earlier about the warrant committee's kind of role in this process. And, one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about, and, honestly, it's up to you to tell me what your role is in this process, because, you're the warrant committee, your charge more than I do. But one of the things that the planning board has been particularly concerned with, and there was just a comment and a question to this effect earlier, is, what is the effect of this zoning going to be on town finances? We have a certain population, we have a certain housing stock, we have a certain school population, we have a certain level of service of police and fire, and we have infrastructure. What are the effects of this going to be on our on our town finances? One thing I will say is that we are using some grant money that we got from the state. We've commissioned a fiscal impact analysis, which with a firm, RKG Associates, very reputable planning firm that does this sort of work all over the Commonwealth and all over the country, where they'll basically, look at what we're proposing for zoning, try to game out, what is the timeline for new units coming online. And then, they're looking at the town budget. They're looking at the school budget. They're looking at the history of call volumes from police and fire. They're looking at, the school age population, based on our existing housing stock. They're talking to all the department heads to put together and try to model out, if this zoning happens, how quickly can we expect, there to be new units coming online? What is their impact going to be on services in town? What is the impact going to be on additional tax revenue, which is the other side of that coin? So that is a process that's ongoing. We will get that to you. I'll probably send it to the planning board first when I get it, but I will send it to the warrant committee second, I promise, because it's an important consideration. I don't think that it's something that, again, based on what the Attorney General has written, compliance is not an option, so we're doing it. But this is a set of data that I think will be very helpful for us in terms of starting to plan our capital budget, starting to plan our future budget for other services. You've got to understand, is this going to be a net revenue generator for the town or a net kind of revenue kind of liability, in which case you need to start to think about, how you make that up. One thing I wanted to share, though, is, some analysis that I've been doing about how our land use regulations affect our revenue and our potential for revenue growth. So with the assistance of our GIS department and the tax assessor, I was able to generate this map of town, which shows, and this is data as of January 22, which is a little outdated, but still pretty good. And it shows how much revenue each parcel in town generates. And this is simply a factor of, what is the assessed value? What is the factor based on residential or commercial? And you sort of come up with, a number of revenue generation. These colors are coded, tan to orange to blue to green in sort of deciles. So, the tan colors are the sort of the lowest tenth of revenue generators.
Tim, quick
and then the
question.
Yes.
So I get it. At the beginning, I had said we wanted sort of basic and quick. You indicated that it was time for basic and quick had gone by, and we were going to get this brief. But it is now 9:40 approximately.
Okay.
How many more slides do you have?
So there's maybe 6 or 7 slides in this kind of discussion. So if we want to cut it short, then we should probably cut it short now, which is totally fine.
Right.
Happy to do it. I put this at the end because I suspected that maybe it would be interesting if we had time. But also if it's getting late, it's not integral. But I did want to sort of get in there that, this is something that the planning board has commissioned a study of this. This is going to be something that's going to be very useful for the planning board. It's going to be very useful for, for the warrant committee, to take a look at in terms of, what the costs and what the revenue kind of potentials are going to be, for the new zoning. So just that's the most important part of this kind of section of the presentation.
No, and thank you. And it certainly is important. Where we are at the very beginning stage of this. So I appreciate that. And we would definitely look forward to getting the brief from the consultants. Do you have any idea when you might be getting that?
Not quite. They are coming in to the next planning board meeting on August 24th to present some initial findings and kind of talk through where they are in their methodology. Obviously we want that and we're expecting it before town meeting. They're working diligently on this. So, I'm hoping it's soon, but we'll have a little bit of a firmer timeline, next week, when they come in for the planning board.
Does anybody have any other questions for Tim while we're here? Are there any? If anybody has their hand up on Zoom and we can't see it, just jump in. Does anybody have any questions?
Are we going to be getting a copy of this presentation, Tim?
We're going to be posting it on the planning department page. Let me just bring that up just so I can show you. On townofmilton.org. If you go to departments, planning and community development, can you still see my screen?
Yes.
On the left side menu, there's the top item is MBTA communities multifamily zoning requirement. This has all the information that we have about MBTA communities, kind of a brief rundown, some resources in terms of state websites and other tools, and then everything that we've ever done. Every presentation, every recording of every forum that we've done gets posted up here. So we'll be posting this presentation tomorrow morning. It'll be here on this website. You can go back and look at previous forums. If you're really a sicko, you can go to the very first one we did and kind of do them in order and learn everything that I know about this stuff, which could be interesting, but, definitely, take a look at some of the more recent presentations just to get a flavor of it. And again, I am making myself 100% available to any members of the committee, that have any specific questions or want to kind of talk this through on a one-on-one basis. I'm happy to take the time to do that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I know that, members of the warrant committee who will be watching the meetings at the planning board, will be watching your presentations at the select board. We look forward. I'm sure that you will come again, and thank you for all of your hard work to the town. It's evident that this is serious time. And a level of professionalism that the town is lucky to have. So thank you.
Well, Dave, I really do appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all. I don't do it nearly enough, so I'm glad that I'm here. Really important to keep you all kind of on as cutting an edge of this stuff as possible, because obviously you do have a extraordinarily important role in the town meeting process. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And again, give me a buzz. Have me back if you start to have some kind of collective questions, and I'm sure we'll be seeing much more of each other in the next couple months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we've had our presentation. We're certainly not voting on anything tonight. We can have a discussion, but again, I don't think that we're getting to the ultimate issue here. We're very early on, but we are a committee. Is there anything that anyone would like to bring up to discuss tonight? Is there anybody on Zoom that I can't see your hand that you want to talk about something? You could just go ahead and shout it out. Okay. If nobody, I don't have anything. Is there a motion on the floor or from the committee?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Is it seconded?
I'll second.
Is there any objection? We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.